It's a great pleasure to be here and want to thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak to you a little bit about my experience in the United States government. I want to just say, just to be clear, that I'm no longer in government, but I had the opportunity to serve my nation for over a decade and have served directly at the Department of State under Secretaries Kerry and Clinton, and in the Bush administration under Secretary Rice. So I come to you with a whole set of different experiences in government, and I was really moved this morning to hear a couple of words that were said by His Excellency and also others this morning. Two words in particular. One was the word vision. The other was the word excellence. And I think it says volumes that all of you are here today over the course of the next couple of days, actually, to hear more about how you can move into an area where not only are you visionary, but you're also achieving excellence. Today, for the next 30 minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about one sector of that engagement that I experienced firsthand, and that is with youth. But I want to begin by telling you a story. Right after the Danish cartoon crisis happened, that was 2006, a lot of you will remember that there was a cartoon that was put out by a Danish newspaper of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that went viral. And it created a lot of disruption on a lot of different levels. But at the United States government level, we were not quite sure in 2006 how something that could happen in Copenhagen could have an effect on a life in Kabul. We are trying to figure that out. And as His Excellency was talking about just a little bit earlier, he was talking about technology. He talked about Instagram, he talked about Twitter, he talked about Google. I want to remind you that in 2006 and 2007, your little Instagram feeds and your WhatsApp were not present, okay? So for us in the United States government, we were trying to unpack it. Now, how many people in this room are under the age of 30? Raise your hand. Okay, there are maybe 20 of you. Okay? So I want to tell you that when I was in government, I was over age 30, and I was not a digital native, and we were trying to figure out how do we contain the concept of a viral mess that was happening around the world if we weren't part of the generation that was using the technology to be able to do it. So in 2007, when I moved from the White House to the Department of State, one of the first things I did was to try to figure out, what are youth saying? What are they thinking? Who is the generation that's actually absorbing what's taking place online? And what I did is I went to Harvard. And I asked the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, that focuses on millennial youth, that looks at digital natives, to help me. I said, we need to have an organized conversation with the exact demographic that's being affected by this cartoon. And we need to understand how we can take hold of some of the ideologies that are going on with extremists and understand how youth interpret it. Now, government always talks about youth. They always talk about how important youth is. But for me, in 2007, when I went to Harvard and I brought people together as a government employee, I brought together people that I knew were the cutting-edge indicators for me to understand what was happening on this very specific thing. Who were the people I brought to the table? Well, today you can Google them. Don't do it now, do it later. But there are three names that you will know. For those of you who are tapping into what Muslim millennial youth are doing, you will know the name Shahid Amanullah, and you will know the name Zahid Amanullah. These are brothers. You will also know a guy named Jared Cohen, who was, at the time, not somebody who is as high up as he is now. He was running Google Ideas, now Jigsaw. Those were three of the millennials that I had around the table. And you know what I asked them? I said, help me understand not only how this thing went viral and how it affected you, but what is the technology we can put on the table to be able to build up youth. Now, I'm telling you that story not because we are so smart at all times in the US government, but it was something for me that was extremely profound. In 2006 and 2007, we were trying to unpack this. For me, it helped me think, who is this generation and what can I learn from them? So I want to say that to you because as we explore the concept of millennial youth, you'll understand why this story was so important for me. So who are this generation? Who are they? How big are they and what do they do? Now, for those of you who have had a little bit of experience in the private sector, you will know that the private sector has done a lot of work to try to understand who these young people actually are. Well, I have some information for you. We know that the millennial generation, those under the age of 30, are the biggest generation, first of all, in American history. They're bigger than Generation X, and they're bigger than the baby boomer generation. So we're looking at a giant demographic. By the year 2036, there will be 81.1 million of this generation digital natives that are on the planet. After 2020, millennials will be a majority of the workforce worldwide. They have a unique set of consumer ideas and principles that some of you will already understand. His Excellency was talking about his daughter and how she interfaced with Instagram and what was taking place. But for those of you who understand the power of the dollar or any other currency that we might look at, we have to understand how these millennials think. What are they doing? So from the private sector, we have a couple of data points that I thought are really important. One, a Goldman Sachs study tells me that they don't like luxury. They balk at expensive cars. They are interested in invigorating the economy in a variety of different ways. Deloitte tells me that 44% of them turned down a job offer because of the organization's values. That's pretty profound. So I'm not going to work at Coca-Cola because I don't like the fact that they're selling sweetened water. That's a profound change that's taking place. We are absorbing it as consumers in the very business perspective. 49% have turned down a job because it was against their personal values. So what does that mean? That means that they're looking at the marketplace in a very different way. They're thinking about their futures in a very different way, and businesses understand it. Why? Because they are advertising for this generation. They want them to come on board. Now, if businesses know what's happening to this generation, what do governments do? I mean, I told you the story of what happened to me when I was trying to understand what was happening to that generation. But that was one person at the State Department. What does an entire nation do as they think about the consumer culture of this generation and what it can do for them? The one thing that we know is that young people have power. They have power and they count. They are globally oriented and world conscious. They care about what is taking place all around the world. So if we know all of this, and we know that they're an important figure and they're important, how does that impact what I've seen happen within the United States government? Well, our government, first of all, understood the power of this generation, and they wanted to go further. President Obama said, "You've never had better tools to make a difference." What did he mean by that when he was talking to a group of young people who had come to see him? He didn't just mean what we usually hear government people say is, this generation matters, you count, very good, it's all very fine. He put his vision and his objective into reality in the way in which he asked each department and agency at the Department of around the government to think about things. So at the Department of State, for example, we understood that youth were an asset. Hillary Clinton said in 2009, just as the Obama administration started, the biggest challenges we face today will be solved by the 60% of the world's population under the age of 30. Now, I just gave you a whole bunch of figures from Deloitte and from Pew and from Goldman Sachs that talked about the value and how these people think about things. But what does that mean if you're in the foreign ministry? What does that mean for us as government officials as we think about President Obama's vision to use them as tools, and Secretary Clinton talking about the power of the demographic under the age of 30? Well, one of the things that we absolutely know is that youth are influencing the way we think about things in the policy demographic, both in the United States and around the world. So from Athens to Afghanistan, youth are leading protests and they are accelerators for ideas that are happening within their generation. Those values that I talked about, not wanting luxury cars, keeping a conscious mind about the kind of organization that they're going to build their lives toward, makes a difference to the way in which they think about policy. So I think about three really important things that have happened that on the American stage, youth have actually been leading the way. And I think these are things that are going to be familiar to you for sure. First of all, let's remember something. Things that happen with youth don't just happen at the end of when you see it on your Instagram feed or on your Twitter feed. Something is happening far before then that is beginning to percolate along the way. And oftentimes, it happens on college campuses. This is a no-brainer. You know that. Peer influence makes a difference. So look at the issue of climate change, for example. Shailene Woodley and others began protests around the Keystone Pipeline, began to talk about how domestically the pipeline was going to make a difference for the way in which we thought about ourselves as Americans, and more importantly, what was going to happen on the global stage. Now, climate change, obviously, is a global issue. It's one that your country and other countries around the world are talking about in very important forums around the world. They come together, ministers come together to talk about things. So what are kids doing? Why are kids part of this conversation? Because the politicians that are going forward, and certainly in our country, are getting squeezed out by the protests and the conversations that are happening in real time, in real space on our shores. You began to see a change in the way senators and congressmen were talking about climate change, and indeed the way businesses were talking about climate change, not because government officials were saying something, but because young people within our country and around the world were protesting, were talking about things. They were seeing trends even before we did as policymakers, sometimes even before we were ready to have that conversation. The issues are shaped and led by youth. It's not to say that their bottom line is always adopted by policy, but certainly we can't ignore what it is that they're saying. So when I think about climate change, I not only think about the Keystone Pipeline, and I think about the fuel divestment movements that have been happening across college campuses, but I think about the eco-friendly movements that have been happening. I mean, even in your country, the way you think about how much your actions have changed within the last 5 to 10 years around how you think about the planet, about what's recyclable, whether or not you're going to use a paper towel or a regular towel that you will have washed, how often you wash it, what you think about. Where did those ideas come from? What was absorbed by you, by your children, first of all, by what you're seeing in the news, but also about what your government peers are also saying. For us in the United States, an issue like climate change was very important in this administration, but it went hand in glove with the kind of movements that were happening around the world and in our country. You can look at the Black Lives Matter that I think some of you have been seeing on your screens as you watch the news in our nation. Racism is a huge issue in our country that has been percolating again, unfortunately, over the course of the last few years. This election cycle has brought it to the fore. But what's brought it even further is the idea that young people aren't standing down. Young people are not waiting for someone to tell them what to do, but rather they're trying to figure out how they can make a difference in the kind of country that we have. What does that make a difference? How does that make a difference to a country? If students are protesting, if things are happening in the street, if marches are happening, how does that make a difference to you as you think about things in your ministry? How does it matter to you as you think about what's taking place around your table as you're coming up with strategies? Well, it makes a difference because the demographic that I told you is growing. And for digital natives, ideas are connecting around the world. If you think that the young people in Dubai are not listening to what their peers are saying around the world, you're greatly mistaken. Ideas are traveling at the speed of light. You know it and I know it, but it influences behavior. That's the point I'm getting at. Not that there are a lot of ideas out there and youth are using ideas, but that they are moving the minds of young people that are going to affect policy. On the issue of Black lives, let me tell you that the change that has taken place with that generation in terms of how they understand things are front and center in the minds of policy people, because they know that these young people have grown up experiencing something that is very akin to the civil rights movement for this generation. We do not yet know how that's going to impact my country. And as we begin to think about things, and I'm going to get to the US election in a minute, but as we think about what happens in the next 4 years and perhaps 8 years for this next president, the issues that are taking place around the Black Lives Movement really will matter. One other example on the issue of policy change for our country. The Occupy movement, many of you will remember, did not just start at the highest level. They started with young people who were putting power to their conscience around their values, around their ethics, around what it is that they believed was the right thing to do. I think it's important to just sort of touch just very briefly on one other aspect here. The youth piece in our country has been very important for us to think about in this last election cycle. We aren't there yet. The election is in the beginning of November. But you will remember the conversations that were happening around Bernie Sanders and how he was able to mobilize youth in a new way. And I'll tell you something. The work that he did to understand what was in the mind of young people and what policy issues made a difference for him, for our country, will absolutely change the way this election is experienced and what happens when we go forward. Now, there are parallels that are happening around the world that I will not get into, but simply to say, politicians are understanding that this generation matters to them, both the millennial generation and what's the generation that comes right after it's called the founder generation. They're moving the needle on some issues that we had not thought about. The compromises that Hillary Clinton has agreed to make around key issues for this generation have everything in the world to do with the galvanization of power that Bernie Sanders was able to get. So what does this all mean, by the way? What does this all mean for government at the larger level? What is the thing that I want to put on the table for you to think about? Government has in my view, two ways to think about young people. One is the traditional way. The traditional way is to listen and to engage, to say to them, listen, you matter, we care about you, you're the future. How many times have you heard that? You're the future. How many people have heard that? Only 3 people, I don't believe you. How many people have heard, you're the future, there you go. You're the future, we care about you, that's why we're going to engage. That isn't good enough. They are obviously the future. They are obviously folks, we all understand that we have to engage them and make them interested in the issues. But there's something more profound here. What you have to understand in terms of your vision and your excellence as government employees in this incredible country is to understand the country that you want to be. It is beyond senior government people making statements like youth are important. It is beyond trying to convene occasionally these efforts that say youth are important and we're putting you on a stage and aren't you good. It is far more important than that. What we have to understand is action that is connected to these statements that are made. And these are some of the lessons that we've understood in the United States. So what have we seen? So on one hand, President Obama did talk about the power of youth and what they can do. But we put money behind that movement, and we put serious attention to the kinds of ways we can sway this next generation. We wanted to build momentum, and we wanted to get the private sector involved as well. So we began to see youth as a force. We began to see them as change makers and change agents that could actually do some of the work that we as government couldn't do for ourselves. We have traditional programs at the Department of State having to do with youth. We see cultural exchange programs all the time. We see education programs that are taking place. We see the kinds of traditional learning that goes around in terms of language and culture and art. But we hadn't seen up until this point a systemic change in the way we thought about what was possible, the art of what had not yet been imagined. And that's where I really want to focus. What hadn't been imagined? So, the United States thought bigger than we had ever thought before. The President of the United States did some really spectacular things. One of the things that he did, that's not this slide, but I will tell you, the African Leaders Initiative, the Young African Leaders Initiative, which was a leadership exercise that came out of the White House, but it combined the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Peace Corps, and the State Department. And it said, we're going to go into Africa and we're going to find the next generation. We're going to build networks, we're going to get their new ideas, and we're going to put them together in critical sectors that will make a difference for our policy needs. We're going to show people that we have buy-in at the highest levels of government, the White House. We're going to show that we're going to have young people support the policy framework, the things, in fact, that were important for the U.S. government. We're going to get youth involved in it. And we're not going to just do a top-down approach by government officials at a very high level telling young people what to do, but we were going to do grassroots up. We were going to listen to what young people had to say. This three-pronged approach with the Young African Leadership Initiative is a fundamentally new way of thinking about the power of the White House and the power of the private sector to come together along with the interagency. We put almost $1 million into this initiative, which is small money, mind you, I understand, but it allowed for small ideas to grow. It allowed for small seed grants to be planted with great ideas in Africa. Now, the president launched this. It's one of his stellar programs that he will talk about at the end of his campaigns, end of his administration, I am sure. But it also served as a platform for us to think about other ways in which the president moved policy forward from the White House stage. You will remember that early on in his administration, he talked about the power of networks and the power of young networks. Entrepreneurship in particular, he talked about. He has convened entrepreneurship summits all around the world since he began, and the heart of that has been social entrepreneurship, business entrepreneurship, and technology entrepreneurship, and young people. And whether you're convening in Washington, D.C., or next year, where it was going to take place in India, you're going to see the change that is taking place with young people because it was started with the idea that their ideas matter. Now, in my view, these are traditional avenues that you can use the power of the United States government to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner. You can show direction and vision and excellence by what's said at the highest level. But you can also show it through actions in brand new ways, and this is where I'm speaking directly to you as government employees. We set a new trend in 2011. Hillary Clinton decided that we needed to do more than just have summits and just have conferences. What she wanted to do was to see how we could get new ideas generated by listening, by doing more to listen. In 2011, she approached this in a new way by setting up an office for youth. She had a senior advisor that was named Ronan Farrow in 2011. He worked on that position for a year, but his job was to go around the world and to speak to young people and to listen to their ideas. He was followed up in 2012 by Zeenath Rahman, who was the special advisor after him, and Zeenath comes to the table with an excruciatingly important background. She comes from the grassroots sector. She's used to connecting ideas at the grassroots and listening to what people are saying. The combination of those two people, I think, was extraordinary. It sent a really powerful message around the world. It said, we, the United States, are not just talking about youth, but we are putting a senior advisor directly in front of the Secretary of State to have that person tell us what young people are saying. So what happened after that, when a country takes the vision and takes leadership and goes forward? Well, I'm happy to tell you the United Nations thought it was a really great idea. The United Nations followed suit in 2013, naming an envoy for youth, Ahmed Al-Andawi. And his job, similar to Ronan and Zeenath's, was to listen, was to go around the world and to hear what young people have to say. In the capacity to lead, for you and for other countries around the world, it is to think bigger than we have thought before. What are things that we can do that no one has done before around the issue of listening and engaging and understanding the millennial generation? One of the things that Ronan and Zeenath did was set up something called youth councils. And these youth councils sounds very boring, doesn't it? No. What they were around the world was to use the power of our embassies to find different voices in a wide range of spaces. A social entrepreneur, a hip-hop artist, an athlete, somebody that young people are talking to that are peer influencers, and put them around the table and say, help us understand what's happening in the Emirates. Tell us what's happening in Nepal. Tell us what's happening in Uganda. Those youth councils were then speaking directly to our ambassadors on the ground. And what happened? They got connections with each other. The peers connected their ideas with each other and got a lot of power from that. Not only did they do that, but they were able to influence how it was that things were happening on the ground. One of my favorite quotes from Ronan, and I want to read it to you, is he said, I got back from launching a council in Latvia, where 2 of our young members started an e-petition that is now used by 20% of the population, that's written into the laws of the country, where if a young person has an idea and launches a petition, it gets a certain number of votes, that has to be passed as a law. Now, that's a pretty radical thing to think about. But it also can mean that young people are thinking in new ways about things that are happening in less radical spaces. Zeenath Rahman talks about a program that she launched called the Youth Map Initiative. The goal of this was to map the youth sector in 8 African countries. Let me stop for a moment. Imagine this, a youth map. A youth map. Think about the Middle East. Can you imagine if you mapped out what young people across the Middle East were thinking about a wide range of issues, and that helped you to understand the way in which policy was going to be absorbed, about what the next generation cared about, and what you could possibly do? Has that ever been done? I don't know. I think this is something to put on your table, but I will say to you, as we think about all of this, we know that there's a lot of potential available. The thing that I will say as I talk about the demographic of young people is to think about the power of Muslim youth, and this is where it comes back to me. Now, you heard in the introduction that I was the special representative to Muslim communities. It was the first time in American history that we had somebody who was only responsible to engage with young people around the world. I was very honored to serve my nation. There are 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30 worldwide, and they matter. When I was sworn in by the Secretary of State in 2009, she asked me to go to where young people were. Now, I did this in Washington. I talked to the people that I report up to, Secretary Clinton, President, Secretary Kerry. But more important than that, even, by the way, was what I experienced on the ground in over 100 countries. From Jordan to Nepal to Indonesia and everywhere in between, I was listening to what young people were saying. And I was listening to what their concerns were. And I was using the power of the United States government to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual power with the ideas that I heard on the ground. And why that was important is because after 9/11, our country needed a new way to engage with Muslim youth. We needed to be able to hear what they had to say. I needed to be able to understand that it was not about liking America. It was about giving the dignity to the voices that I heard on the ground so that I could bring back that information to Washington and say, what are new things that we can do? In the job of Special Representative to Muslim Community, I was able to do quite a few things. I was able to build networks of like-minded thinkers. One of my favorite networks is called Generation Change. We handpicked young people from around the world, from Comoros to the Emirates, by the way, to Norway, to India, and said to them, what are the best ideas that you have on the ground? We built 30 chapters of young people around the world, more than 600 of them, who were change agents, who said we want to build a better world and we don't want to be pigeonholed as Muslims as one thing. We want you to think differently about who we are as young women and young men. We want you to understand that what terrorist organizations are saying about our country, about our religion, is not who we are. We want you, America, to understand that there is far more diversity around Muslims around the world than you understand. That a Muslim living in the Emirates is not the same as a Muslim living in Syria. That you have to understand that the vast and very deep and very honorable traditions of Islam for over 1,400 years should give us respect. And what that did for us was it was able to make America think about new programs that were going to make a difference for Muslim youth. From Generation Change to programs like Viral Peace and Hours Against Hate, programs in which young people were able to get their ideas on the table, to be able to push back against stereotypes and sound bites. It allowed us a new platform. The last slide you saw was of me with a sign that said, "At America." That was taken in Jakarta at one of the final things I want to leave you with because it's a new idea. Our government set up these centers, and this one was set up in a mall in Jakarta where we knew young people would come. And we wanted to tell them the story of America, but we also wanted to give them a place in which they can connect great ideas. And as the largest nation of a Muslim majority nation in the world, it was very important for me to hear what these young Muslims were saying. It is an incredibly interesting idea to set up places where young people can go if you are government. It is not something we often do. But what I want to leave you with is this. As I think about the opportunity I had in the United States government to think out of the box, to be more creative than we've ever been before, to think about the power of this generation, I absolutely know that the new opportunities available to us are unlimited, that we have to go further than we've ever gone before. And my challenge to you, as you think about your nation, your job as government officials, and the incredibly inspiring words that came from His Excellency right before I came here, who do you want to be? How do you get there if you're not listening to the next generation? I urge you to think out of the box. I urge you to be bold, and I urge you to help us, everybody outside of your nation and within it, be the world that we can be by building up the ideas and the potential of the next generation. Thank you so much.